Good morning, class. Today's lecture is on communication and community. I'll be trying to explain this concept to all of you with examples from early India. Communication has always been thought of in terms of the modern. Communication has always been tried to be measured in terms of quantities of amounts of information. In present day times, probably amounts of or packets of digital information. So but we in this lecture we try to understand this concept of communication from the perspective of community, uh, because something that is very common to our understanding is that communication cannot exist without community itself. So community is where communication rises from. So let us get into the lecture and look at the different paradigms of this understanding. So as I already mentioned, communication in its present understanding is mostly an understanding from Western perspectives. So this kind of a perspective is determined by the concept of technology. It's a technology determinant. So the beginning of the open era, the beginning of the 20th century, you will realize that we started to see an onslaught of communication technologies amidst us, more so during the period of the two great wars. So we see a lot of technology that arose because these were needed to fight wars. The World War I and the World War II are such two epochs in terms of communication technology, because these were the period in our history when we see a major dependence on technology arose, although those technologies are for war. But communication was also needed during this war to better communicate with your field forces. So the headquarters wanted to be in touch with what was happening on the field, and thus arose need for things such as wireless transistors, things such as telephony, the telegraph itself. So a lot of such scientific technologies arose due to the need of war, and from there arose our modern understanding of communication as a technologically determinant concept, where we were more reliant on ideas of technology. But this understanding of communication is again problematic in the sense that in its whole understanding of communication, we don't take into consideration the concept of the human itself. We don't take into consideration local realities, the needs of the community. We don't talk about how the society perceives communication. Methodologies which were dependent on such kind of communication were very narrow in its scope and definition, right? So diversity was not a very strong point of such kind of a communication idiom, if I may say so. uh, so there always remained a lack in our understanding of modern day communication. This lack needed to be addressed at some point or the other. Now remember, this is the 20th century is also the time when we see majorly the revival, or for not revival, the coming up of disciplines such as communication. So most of this schools of communication or departments of communication across the globe which came up only during the 20th century, would then, you would now understand, were majorly looking at the concept of technology itself, because such was the demand of the time which in which they existed. uh, but communication was important. This realization started to arise after the wars, more so even after the Second World War, when we see the paradigm of propaganda taking shape. And propaganda made us realize that communication could be used in ways in which we would have never imagined in our lives. And propaganda was something where information could be measured, and that was considered to be uh, communication, measurable information. How much could you affect the minds of the receiver of a message? So in this kind of a paradigm, the concept of communication started to evolve, and we started seeing, after propaganda studies, we started seeing behavior studies in communication. We started seeing advertisement studies in communication, where we were talking about how to sell goods based on how would you be able to change behavior of people on the basis of your ads. Because ads are nothing but making people buy stuff, making people change their daily habits to accommodate something new in their lives, to accommodate a new behavior, let's say a washing machine, or let's say a kitchen chimney, or let's say a television in people's lives. So making people buy them needed advertisements. So advertisements would be communication messages which would lead to change in behavior of or lifestyle of the people that were intended to be changed. So when we could change people's lives, change people's behavior, communication started to be measured. How much could you change this behavior? So we were slowly moving from a technology based idea to a behavioral idea, but the concept remained same. It had to be measurable. mm. So this were some of the contemporary concepts of communication that remained, but all of this at some point remained problematic. These were very narrow based concepts, the concepts which would not talk about the formats of communication or the idea of communication that existed before technologies. Now that is what we are trying to understand in this class, and more so specifically, more so from the perspective of our country, India. uh, when we talk about a pre-technological era, communication of course was there because humans were around. We find a lot of, and probably you must have heard a lot about, let's say, cave paintings of Ajanta, or cave paintings in Bhimbetka caves, which are thousands and thousands of years old. Uh, some of them have been dated already. So we were looking at some of the earliest forms of communication in this paintings. Mm, so now today we understand that some of these paintings of animals in the caves of Bhimbetka were, for example, not only depicting their lives, but also trying to tell others that what animals could be domesticated, or what animals could be eaten as meat. So they would be also used as a kind of a warning for others, what animals are, which animals are safe and which animals are not. So this cave paintings served a lot of purposes for people around them. Again, another case that I remember now is the unicorn bull from the Harappan civilization. And the Harappa and the Mohenjo-daro civilization actually had a lot of image based ideas. Now, this image based ideas, although we haven't been able to decipher much of it, but we know that they were communicating a lot of meaning through their images, through their clay tablets. Uh, so, worldwide we see a lot of such evidences of communication which have been there pre technology, and just because they were pre technology does not mean that they were useless. Now, this communication would have, these forms of communication would have been alive for a long time, because technology is probably an infant in terms of the history of humankind. Technology is only hardly 100 or 200 years old. Probably the industrial revolution can be taken as a marker. So, the arrival, the kind of communicating means that we adopted as humans would start from cave paintings to papyrus paper writings in Egyptian civilizations, or writings on silk cloth in many civilizations. So, all of those forms of communication existed, we have seen in our history books. Uh, and there are so many kinds of scripts which are yet to be deciphered, including the Harappan thing. So, there has been, so but let us then try to come to um, a communication means which we still understand pre technology, but we know the meaning, and I'll draw from the Indian experience here. In the Indian experience, communication uh, could be traced back as far as the scripture goes. So, the holy books or the scriptures, I will avoid using the word holy here. I would use the word scripture rather. So, scriptures have been part of our civilization for thousands of years. So, the written script itself is a kind of uh, marker or an indicator to our beginning of communication. So, the Upanishads, the Gitas, the Vedas, all of this constitute what we understand as the scripture based communicating forms that we have. Uh, Sanskrit as a language churned out a lot of literature, churned out a lot of edicts, churned out a lot of pillars, churned out a lot of wall writings. Not just Sanskrit, for example, Pali, the language of the Buddhist scriptures, churned out a lot of literature. Right, we have so many texts available with us which are thousands of years old. In fact, some of these texts, most of these texts, in fact, don't have a single author but have multiple authors over centuries. And what we have today is nothing but a refined version of the works of hundreds of such scholars. Mm, like Charaka's the Charaka Samhita is mm, an important treatise in the field of medicine, the Charaka Samhita. And the Charaka Samhita is not a writing of an individual, but it's a seminar. It's a seminar on medical sciences. We don't know yet the place where it was held, but it's a classic text on the kind of discussion that took place in a conference in ancient India between several medical practitioners. Uh, all those kind of texts are some of the earliest forms of communication that we see in the Indian context. Apart from scriptures, you will also see we have had a strong mystic element in our civilization, some of which is known to us today, some of which we probably might have lost. So, and mysticism is mostly interpersonal kind of a philosophy and interpersonal kind of a communication. Some of the earliest forms of interpersonal communication would be mysticism, so where the person is talking to oneself, and that is mysticism, right? Mirabai's philosophy or Kabir's philosophy, all of those would be all of those would come under the mysticism school of communication. And during ancient India, philosophy schools also started to develop and refine at the same point in time, and we see several schools of philosophy coming up, and several in every school of philosophy we followed some or the other kind of ideals. And so these are some of the ideas of communication that we see in ancient India. uh, so I am trying to avoid the cave paintings. I am trying to give you a sense of what happens after. So all of this can be considered essence of communication, the early communication that we see in the Indian scenario, right? So if we then try to understand this whole concept, these books, these scriptures, and these texts and the edicts, the pillars of Ashoka, and everything else, we will realize that what is communication. The communication is nothing but transfer of meaning from one person to the other. So I am trying to say something, I am trying to say something to my audience. I am trying to say, let's say I am the king and I am trying to say something to my subjects. So what I do is I erect pillars, and I write therein the codes of law that should be followed by every subject in my kingdom, and that is in essence communication. If you look at modern ideas of communication, is not much different other than one basic thing, um, and I'll come to that. So even in modern sense of communication, there is a sender of the message, and there is a receiver. So there is somebody who encodes a message and there is somebody who decodes a message, um, and this whole relationship, sender and the receiver, is a two-way relationship. It cannot be a one-way relationship. It's a two-way relationship where both make meaning. So in the Indian model, the intrapersonal is the meaning making process, right? So the Indian mysticism, for example, is a classic case, is where the individual himself or herself makes meaning. He or she becomes aware of the external stimulus, and which makes meaning unto the person. This is what we would understand as this English word, for lack of a correct word, enlightenment, right? Enlightenment is what differentiated this early forms of communication in the Indian context to what we understand as Western models. So in the Western model, it's a relationship, it's an external relationship, while as in the Indian model, it could also be an internalization of the message, where after I get the message, I might attain enlightenment, which is a classic, which throughout history I am sure all of you would have kept on reading about the Buddha. So the Buddha becomes the Buddha after he attains enlightenment. So this is the effect of a certain form of communication. So all of those things that I cited earlier in this slide uh, are forms of attainment of that enlightenment, that awareness. Awareness would be a more contemporary term of understanding. I understand that not everybody attains enlightenment, but how you become aware of yourself, aware of the surroundings around you, and all of these things make sense to us slowly. So this is the Indian way. So enlightenment in case of Buddha, and so generally is understood as liberation from ignorance, right, from illusion of the material world or all the artificial categories. So you are enlightened, you are aware, you can make difference between the material and the spiritual. You are free from the illusions, you are free from Maya, so you can attain salvation, right? So that is enlightenment. So the Indian idea of communication was more internal, all right. And the yogis and the sadhus, the sages would have done it for centuries and centuries. So this is a very complex way of understanding communication, but it remains a fact that intrapersonal communication is probably one of the toughest ways of communicating, right? So this search for meaning is an internal process, right? So many people would also consider enlightenment as the attainment of truth. In the case of Buddha, it was the attainment of truth, the realization of truth, right? So here truth is sometimes, what is true, what is real, what is the physical, and what is the spiritual. That understanding cannot always be attained by language or logic, and that is why the Indian concept of communication negates this technologically determinant idea of communication, where everything needs to be measured, where everything needs to be quantified, and thus truth cannot be quantified. Self realization, liberation from ignorance cannot be quantified. Illusion of the material cannot be quantified, right? So it's an intuitive process, right? So this is, according to the Indian philosophy, the end purpose of communication, what communication ought to achieve, what communication ought to. So all of this talk that we do, how does it so when I talk to you, does it help you in a moment of self realization, right? So do you think yourself, do you take in this lecture for a case in point and think about it in your own brain, make it an intuitive process, and do you attain at something higher, do you attain at something more liberating, something more enlightening, something more nearer to the truth? I won't say achieving truth is so easy, but it's so easy, but something nearer to the truth. And that is how you would differentiate between these two categories of communication: the Indian way, the ancient or the early Indian way, and the Western technologically determinant concept of communication, right? Now, one of the earliest texts or scripture that we have is Natya Shastra by Bharata Muni. Again, Natya Shastra also, as is said, is probably not by a single author, would have been refined in centuries after centuries. So some of the earliest forms of Natya Shastra probably is dated back to some 500 BC. So it rolled on, and probably oral for a most part of its history, and then it was given a form. Now, Natya Shastra is a communicative text. Natya Shastra is a text on, as you all know, probably is a text which deals with performance, and it gave a Shastra form to a field of knowledge. A Shastra form would be a studies form in the more Western educational idea. So, Natya Shastra uses a terminology called Sadharanikaran. Now, it's a Sanskrit word, Sadharanikaran, which comes from the word Sadharan. Sadharan would mean simple, right? Or simplification, in this case, Sadharanikaran. If I want to find a Latin relevant word to it, it would mean communes, or which is the Latin for communication again. So Sadharanikaran, on simplification, is one word that probably has come to signify the paradigm of communication that we are referring to today in this class. Uh, why is Sadharanikaran important? Let me explain. So, it means simplification or communes in Latin, right? So, when Sadharanikaran happens, commonness of experience takes place. What is commonness of experience? So, let me talk about Natya. So, Natya Shastra is talking about the Indian play. So, at the towards the end of the play, when we are reaching the climax of the play, the whole amount of emotion that goes on with which the actor is playing the character, the amount of pathos, the amount of emotion that he puts into the character, the audience slowly uh, gets into the mood of the character. The audience slowly becomes one with the actor. The experiences of the audience and the experiences of the actor become one. So, that is Sadharanikaran, where there is a commonness of experience. So, the way in which the actor would have played his role, the audience identifies with that. The audience is moved by that performance, and that is that moment when communication takes place. This is the state of universalization. This is a universalization phase, because the emotional intensity of both these persons have matched. Sadharanikaran has taken place. He has become common with that actor. The audience has become common with the actor. The actor has become common with the audience. They are but one and the same person at that moment, at that peak of performance. And that is the state of universalization. Emotion is, remember, is a universal idea. Emotion is universal. So, the audience also connects to the actor. So, the emotional intensity of the sender in this case is the actor in the play. The emotional intensity of the sender and the receiver become one. They become one, and this becoming one, both the sender and the receiver, is, in terms of Natya Shastra, it's called the Sahridyas, right? Now, one idea of Sahridyas is, Sahridyas means two persons belonging to the same cultural background. So, that what happens is, when they belong to the same two Sahridyas, the sender and the receiver become one, become the universalization happens, communication takes place. So, this two Sahridyas, between them there has been an emotion give and take, that means communication has taken place. So, then at this moment they are called the Sahridyas. So, Sahridyas then can be understood as people who are belonging to the same cultural group. If they belong to the same cultural group, if they have the same kind of a background, if they belong to the same kind of a thought process, what happens is, the relevance of the message, the act of communication goes higher and higher. So, the code or the message that was supposed to be passed on to the audience becomes successful. So, the success depends on how much of the same affinity does the sender and the receiver belong to. If they belong to a very close affinity, the understanding would be even higher. You can you will always see siblings, brother and sisters, or two brothers or two sisters. You'll see the kind of bonding between them is a result because they have grown up in the same household, and so there is such an attachment between them. because their cultural affinity is very high, because of the fact that their backgrounds are same, the household is same, they have the same parents. So it's in almost in identical manner. Sahardiyas, the act of communication between two Sardhyas is possible more when the affinities are even closer and closer, right? Now, affinities are closer does not necessarily mean that they needed to be from the same village, or they needed to be from the same community. Does not necessarily mean that. Cultural affinity closeness could also happen with, it's a matter of the mind also. I could be spiritually nearer to somebody, and in the religious context we have seen that people from different diverse villages, towns would come together under a single religious guru, and they would form a cultural affinity group. So cultural affinity does not necessarily mean, belong coming from the same background. So this concept of Sahridyas have also taken some other form. I am Let me explain that. Um, so as I said, in the case of Sahridyas, the communication is successful, but in the Indian context, this moment of communication, this moment of messages being successfully converted from the sender to the receiver, is in a relationship where there is some kind of a hierarchy, right? Um, in the Western model, this hierarchies have not yet been studied and probably doesn't exist, because technology also does away with hierarchies in a way. Um, Hierarchies are part of the model of communication in the Indian case. So there is an element of power attached on the sender. So the sender of the message, the encoder of the message, wields a certain kind of power over the receiver, a relationship of domination and subordination, right? And the source, the sender, being of course higher in the relationship, in this hierarchical relationship. A classic case, as I have written in the slide, a Guru Shishya Parampara would be a classic case in point, where the Guru and the Shishya are in a relationship of communication, where the Guru takes a higher place in that relationship by virtue of the fact that he is the sender of the message most of the times. But the concept of Saharidias and this concept of cultural affinity has over the centuries been so interpreted that cultural affinity has come on to take the concept of this hierarchy, has taken the concept of being structural society, the concept of the rigidity in the structural of the structures of the Indian society has come from this idea of hierarchy. And over the centuries, this hierarchy has only but increased. This rigidity of the structure of the Indian society has only but increased. So what has happened is uh, the caste system, for example, is a classic case in point of how the hierarchical system has come to occupy the center of the Indian civilization, rather than only being part of the philosophical structure of communication. It became the rigid structure of society itself. So it has influenced. So what has happened is the structure of the society. So this is a highly problematic proposition that has come to take place in our society. Now, it wasn't intended in such a manner. It was intended as only a communicating device where there is a hierarchy between the sender and the receiver. But it has become structured, it has concretized over the centuries. And of course, then what happens is it has also influenced how we as a society we communicate among each other, how as a society we slowly start to inculcate this hierarchical notion in everyday aspects of our life. So, hierarchies in the way people talk to each other, hierarchies in the way in which we have made structures of our society, how the caste system comes in, the four sections happens, right. So, this has some kind of probably one of the worst things that could happen to the Indian society has also come from this location. Now, the concept of Guru Shishya that I gave you. So, communication in ancient India or early part of our civilization, pre-technological times, was mostly an idea which is confined to a step flow kind of communication. There are a few reasons to it, and one is that the concept of the Guru, the concept of the wise man, wise people, the concept of power structure, because obviously powerful people would be less, they would act as the first step of communication. So, the communication would then pass on to the common subjects. So, this is what I mean by step flow of communication, from the king then to his ministers, from them to the private citizens of the kingdom. um, Even today probably we see step flow kind of communication still existing. Let's say, when you walk into a saloon, you hear a lot of stories and rumors. So, saloon acts as a step flow kind of communication, where there are a few uh, people in society who act as, the bearers of stories, um, who would who are masters at carrying stories around, who would pass on the information, right. If I can bring in a very contemporary idea from the world of modern communication, you will realize, I'm sure you have heard of the national NRHM, right, National Rural Health Mission, and you will see there are a lot of ASHA workers in NRHM. So, the ASHA workers are the carriers of information. So, from people who decide on what communication needs to be passed on, let's say on maternal health, let's say on pediatric health, let's say on menstrual hygiene. So, all of this information are passed on to the ASHA. They are trained how to talk to the common people, how to talk to people on the ground, and then these ASHA workers carry the same message to the grassroots level. So, this is a classic example of a step flow model, right. So, in ancient times we see a step flow. So, teachers would be a classic example of a step flow model, where teachers are people who would spread knowledge, right, in the society. So, most of the communication that took place in Indian society can be categorized as a step flow idea, right. Thus, with all its problems intact, still we can argue that there existed a very thriving method, an indigenous system of communication that existed in most societies, and more so in the case of our country. So, we see that with all of these examples. Now, let me come to a few grassroots kind of ideas of communication that existed, uh, forms of media which would pass on messages to the grassroots. And here I introduce to you the concept of the folk media forms that has existed from time immemorial, and they have acted as media forms, messaging forms amongst the masses. So, this folk media forms, folk or traditional media forms, have been used from ages to pass on moral messages, religious messages, mostly religious in the case of India, and also socio-political messages in this country. Mm, so, folk media has acted as one of the iconic ways in which we have communicated meaning for a long time, for centuries together, right? So if you look at some of the characteristics of the folk tradition, you will realize that in the folk tradition, the entertainer, the audience and the community are all rolled into one. So the hierarchical structure is broken somewhat in this folk traditions, because people who also perform are part of the community, the audience. So everybody partakes in that kind of a performance in the folk and traditional forms of media, right? And how have folk forms evolved? Oh, of course they have evolved over centuries, but most of the time they have evolved as sites of resistance to forces, you know uh, to forces that have been counter to society. So these have always been rebellious forms which were requirement of the time that people lived in. So in different times different kind of forms would have emerged, right? Like songs, in songs you would have, rebellious songs which carry meaning of revolt. So all of this kind of traditional forms would have arose at some point in time where society demanded that such forms be used for purpose of educating people on some messages, right? So what has happened is, in all parts of the country we see thousands of such folk media forms have evolved, and they have formed this base of knowledge, what we consider as legends, myths and imageries of sound and symbolism over the centuries. So this is what we as uh, traditional communication scholars would be more interested in today, because this is what survives. Those Sanskrit texts which we were talking earlier are not as popular today amongst us, but these folk media forms have survived and they still thrive, and some of them are really popular, right? So folk media forms or traditional media forms can be divided into this broad 5 categories that we have today, actually, that we see around us. So folk theater is a classical way, uh, where there are, and I'll give you some examples in the next 2-3 slides. Folk songs, which are very popular, and folk songs are very much part of our wedding rituals. For example, in most communities across India, folk songs are part of monsoon, folk songs are part of rain, famine, drought. So there are folk songs for every occasion in the Indian society. Ballads or folk tales and other storytelling, this is the narrative form of folk media, where storytelling has always been a classic form of folk media, where you pass on knowledge from generation to generation. So children are generally the bearer of this sort of a knowledge form. Religious discourse has come to occupy a very important kind of a folk media practice, where religion is propagated through this discourse method. Religion is propagated through folk method, right? And you can see the success of this by the amount of people, by the how people throng these discourses in thousands. Puppet shows is very ancient in India, probably one of the most threatened form of folk media today, uh, but it's still there. We find a lot of forms still surviving, and there are people who are working really hard in this field. Most of this you will realize, then when I say all of this, you will realize that folk media has been from time and again used to propagate um, messages amongst the masses, because this kind of folk media have arised from the community itself. So they have been used by a lot of agencies, including the government, to pass on message, behavioral change message, messages on health, hygiene. In fact, recently on COVID times, we had such kind of message going on, where people would be people would be um, people would be taught the importance of vaccines by importance of vaccines through such folk means. Now I try to give you some idea of a few examples of folk media which are very popular, and that's why I've just cited this. I can cite only 2 or 3 in this few slides, but believe me, there are thousands of other examples of folk media that are available in this country. In fact, in Northeast India, we have a lot of surviving folk media forms which are thriving really well. Now, Tamasha, as you all know, is a form that is very popular in Maharashtra, in the western part of the country. It's a commercial form of theater, right? So here female performers carries the program, right, by singing and dancing, and most of the time today it's on demand. So people demand certain songs and they would dance. Now it is said that two folk media forms of India. So in fact, when you consider the Indian movie industry, you will see the Indian cinema industry has been influenced by two folk media forms mainly. One of them is Tamasha, the other being Notanki. So these two forms have made their imprint on the Indian cinema in a major way. The way in which we today visualize this concept of Bollywood song and dance probably has its roots in Tamasha and of course Notanki. Okay, Kirtan. Now Kirtan is again part of a religious discourse, very popular. You see on the streets, you see it in various other temples and all. You also see it in secular places. uh, Kirtana, as also Hari Kirtana, which would relate to Lord Vishnu or Krishna. So these are monodramas in which the whole performance is done by one actor who will perform roles simultaneously of various characters and tells the story, right? So tells a particular story related to a or related to a religious figure, right? So generally from the epics, very understand. So Kirtan as a form is popular all over the country, and we find it in Maharashtra, in Bengal. We also find types of Kirtan in Manipur, in Assam itself. So Kirtana is a very thriving form of folk media. Yakshagana is popular in Karnataka. It's widely used and widely propagated. It attracts thousands of people. So Bhagavad Gita forms the main text of Yakshagana, right? Mm, but what happens is the difference being when the Bhagavad Gita is being told and retold, there would be local flavors would be added to Yakshagana so as to make it more charming for the audience, right? And as time has passed by, all of these folk media forms would have taken on new characteristics, right? So the narrator sings the song and explains parts of the Gita to the audience. As I said earlier, I referred to Notanki, another folk drama form, mostly seen in a lot of parts of India. So it's performed in an open space, right? And there is a sutradhar who narrates, right? And the stories are taken from again from epics or historical events that might be important for that particular region. Notangi again is very famous in Maharashtra, for example. Now Jatra, and there are various forms of Jatra that is available in this country. I have just written Jatra, but Jatra can be of various types. Is also known in through various other names. Orissa, Bengal, the Northeast, Jatra is available everywhere. Um, so Jatra is more professional, where a team goes and sets up a stage. Professional people act. So there is a whole song, dance, and a story, of course, that goes along with the jatra. So it's very attractive. In fact, probably the precursor to our modern day cinema, jatra would have been the most popular form, right? So if you look at in Assam, for example, Ankiya Nat Bhavna is probably something which comes very near to this idea, because this is also plays from our myths and epics, and plays which are written by religious gurus. And Ankiya Nat Bhavnas are staged. They are not just staged in religious places, but also staged in secular theatre setups, and there is a lot of other such forms available across the country. uh, Another name that is very important that we come across in this country is Ram Leela, and of course Ras Leela. Now again, these are play enactments. Both are widely popular in rural India, of course, and also in urban India. We see a lot of Ram Leela being staged in urban India today, and they also carry a lot of political meaning. While Ram Leela, as can the name suggests, would be on the life and victory of Lord Rama, and his victory over Ravana, or any part of his life story would also be played out in the stage. Uh, while uh, while Ras Leela is celebrated widely in the eastern part of the country, in some parts of the northern India also. Apart from in Kerala, Maharashtra, they are also being staged. While Ras Leela then would refer to the romantic liaisons of Lord Krishna and Radha, and his stories of love, and the play enactments of the gopis. So all of those would be staged, and to make the story of the epics more palatable to the common audience. Now, time and again, I am telling you, all of these folk media forms that we have are all popular folk media forms that I have cited. So there would be hundreds and thousands of other folk media forms. Those probably are not as popular, like folk paintings and all, but yet they survive and they thrive, and they carry a lot of weight and meaning. And most of these forms which are popular are used by a lot by the government and a lot of other developmental agencies to bring about behavioral change among the audience. A lot of messages is passed to the audience, because as I said, a lot of local flavor would be added to these stories to make it more palatable to the audience. And that's how traditional media forms have uh, kept up with the times and kept their popularity intact, and people take interest in those stories, and this is how uh, folk media survives, and probably survives more than ever before. uh, Puppet tradition in India today probably is one of the most dwindling one. It's endangered, but still there are a lot of people who work in this field. So basically can be divided into four types of puppetry in this country. uh, the first one is the sutradhari form, where the sutradhari is the thread. So where the puppets are tied to strings, and the strings, multiple strings are attached to the fingers of the person who is playing the puppets, and we see this form of puppet being very popular in places such as Rajasthan also. um, Rod puppet. A rod puppet is basically a heavy wooden stick or a bamboo stick is attached to the waist of the puppets, and this would make the puppets dance along with the weight. In West Bengal, it is called the Putul Nach, right? Then shadow puppets. Shadow puppet is a very popular form. It's found in a lot of places actually in this country, in Kerala, in Andhra Pradesh, in Odisha, also in Chaya Nach in Rajasthan. So very popular form. Shadow puppets in Kerala, for example, is mostly done on the epics stories from Ramayana and Mahabharata. And lastly, the handmade puppets. Handmade puppets, probably today is the most popular forms of puppetry across the world actually. So they have taken forms of Muppets and all, and mascots of different teams are puppets today. In sports, in NBA, in American baseball, you will notice puppets. All teams have their mascots, puppets as mascots. So puppets today are very popular. So handmade puppet in India is again popular in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and the characters look like the Kathakali dancers, right? So another very important form of puppets. So with this, I come to the end of my lecture on community and communication in India. So the whole attempt was in telling you how communication in the Indian context arose from the concept of the community itself rather than being airdropped from technology. So the concept of communicating is linked to enlightenment, is linked to the concept of oneness, universalization or sadharanikaran, as I said, and that's why all of this communication tools or folk media tools that are there are still popular and probably is carries more weight and meaning in today's contemporary society. With this, I come to my end of my lecture. Best of luck to all of you, and thank you. Have a great day.